Increasingly different but equally successful, how far do you agree with these judgments on the economies of the North and the South of the USA in the period to 1850? A commonly held belief is that the North was an industrial behemoth, existing in union with a somewhat weaker, or at least less modern, agricultural South. Whilst to an extent this is true, it would not entirely follow that the northern economy was more successful than her southern counterpart. Indeed, the export of cotton and the steadily rising price of slaves point to the fact that the two sectional economies were equally successful, whilst growing very distinct from one another. The armchair historian would blindly assert that the North was industrial and the South agrarian. Although this has a hint of generalisation about it, it is largely the case. Notwithstanding the sweeping agricultural prairies of the recently settled Midwest, the North was fast becoming the most industrial centre of manufacturing in the world. Cities such as New York, Boston and Philadelphia were hubs of industry, and accordingly the numbers of Northerners working in agriculture dropped by approximately 20% in the years following 1800. Similarly, towns and cities sprang up across the North. No better example being Chicago, the Windy City, which had only 40 inhabitants by the early 1830s, yet only a couple of decades later its population dwarfed that of every southern city excluding New Orleans. The people urbanised to work in the factories, and their numbers were swollen further by the influx of foreigners, particularly Irish and German, who added their obvious manpower to the industrial workforce as well as a considerable amount of innovation. The trends of urbanisation and immigration were added to by an enlightened view of education. For the average northerner, education represented the best way of self-improvement. As a byproduct, it led to an increasingly innovative and diverse workforce, thus continuing the modernisation and success of the northern economy. If the economy of the North was fluid and forward-looking, that of the South was steepled in pride and tradition. Not for them was the un-Americanism of overindulging in industry and commerce. Although some enterprises such as the Tredegar Iron Works in Virginia, the entire nation's fourth largest industrial producer, showed the South had some minor tendency to industrialisation, the vast majority of the southern economy, and in fact society, was based in agriculture, more specifically the southern planters. Owning vast tracts of fertile land, these oligarchs used slave labour in the mass production of labour-intensive crops, such as rice, sugar, tobacco, but most significantly cotton. The dominance of cotton in the South was caused ironically by a northern invention, Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793. Thus enabled the South grew ever vaster amounts of cotton, with France and the UK providing an insatiable market. Cotton as a contributor to the southern economy, 4,000 bales in 1791, had become King Cotton, 5 million bales by 1860. Thus, cotton and slavery existed in harmony, a symbiosis of product and method. To state the southern economy was less successful than that of the North is to study antebellum US history with one eye shut. The success of slavery and cotton did little to incentivise southern planters to turn to industry. In fact, the profits to be made in the South were equitable to those made by northern industrialists. Some historians have tended to let morality get in the way of sound judgment. The southern economy was thriving. The South did not boast the spectacular metropolises of the North, notwithstanding the multicultural anomaly of New Orleans. Urbanisation was not required and immigration happened on a far lesser scale, for there were not the available jobs in industry, and the employment and labour required in the agrarian southern economy was satisfied by slavery. Thus it can be concluded, in accordance with the question, that the sectional economies were increasingly different. That being said, it would be remiss not to note some very distinguishable similarities. Firstly, that both economies were dominated by rich, albeit wholly disparate, oligarchs. The South was dominated by the plantation owners, and the North by the emerging industrialists. Interestingly, both of these classes operated on a sophisticated capitalist profit-based model, consequently dispelling the myth that the southern economy was stunted and backward. Such an assumption totally underestimates the financial acumen of the planters, who were raking in money hand over fist through their efficient and market-driven principles. It was not only at the top of the economic tree where similarities were present. The average northerner as well as southerner was a self-sufficient farmer, owning between 50 and 500 acres of land. It should also here be noted that by 1850, 75% of southern farmers did not utilise slave labour. Perhaps a more accurate assessment would be that both economies shared a common heritage, but the North, through heavy-scale industrialisation, was developing very differently from their more traditional southern counterpart. One final point needs addressing when assessing the comparable merits of the economies, and it is one that the power of hindsight makes imperative to consider. Although strictly speaking both economies were equally successful by 1850, the South was handicapped by a lack of foresight and a mistaken belief in its own superiority. The seminal work on this subject, H.R. Helper's The Impending Crisis of the South, shows that the South's blind reliance on King Cotton prevented her from diversifying her economy, with tragic consequences, as fatefully proven by her economic collapse during the American Civil War. Manual labour was disabused by the presence of slave labour, and slavery also saw many Southerners migrate to the North to pursue their plans. Slavery and cotton was not open to change and progress. Thus was the South hamstrung by her primary strength. Theoretically, if the price of cotton fell, the South would suffer. In the event of things, it was not the price, but the actual market for cotton that evaporated, courtesy of the Union naval blockade effected during the American Civil War. The fact that the Southern economy was reliant on cotton prevented her from having a reserve strategy, a Plan B. Thus, the glory of the South's economic performance was based on very shaky foundations, in contrast to that of the North, which had many strings to its bow, which gave it great resilience. Additionally, Southern reliance on Northern banking, credit and transportation, precipitated by her chronic shortage of these facilities, showed to a large degree that Southern success was not independently sustainable. In conclusion, therefore, it must be concluded that up until the period 1850, that the northern and southern economies shared great similarities, the domination by wealthy oligarchs and the lifestyle of the average farmer, but were growing increasingly different due to industrialisation and, more specifically, urbanisation, immigration and education. On the surface of things, the economies were equally successful, with the profits of manufacturing and cotton bringing roughly equitable wealth to both sections. Yet bubbling under the surface was the unsustainability of the South's economy, crippled by her own rhetoric of King Cotton. Therefore, the economies were increasingly different, but it was the North that boasted the more successful model.